beyond a cold dawn, a 9-year-old girl living on the streets knocked desperately on the door of a millionaire businessman's mansion. In her arms, she carried a newborn baby she had found in an unimaginable situation. With tears in her eyes, she looked at the man who had always been kind to her and whispered, trembling, "Uncle, I found this baby in the trash." He laughed, thinking it was just another childish trick, until his eyes fell on the small tag sewn into the baby's clothes. The name he read there changed everything forever. The pre-dawn chill of New York City was a blade of ice, slicing through the thin, torn fabric of Leah's jacket. At 9 years old, she knew all the faces of cold, the kind that stiffened her fingers, the kind that made her teeth chatter uncontrollably, and worst of all, the cold that radiated from the indifference of others. But tonight, a fragile, precious warmth was nestled in her arms, wrapped in a threadbare blanket she'd found days earlier. A warmth that whimpered softly, a sound that echoed the same helplessness she felt in her own heart. The sour smell of the hospital dumpster still clung to her clothes, but the faint scent of powder and milk emanating from the small bundle in her lap was the only thing that mattered. She had walked for what felt like endless city blocks, driven by the fierce determination of someone carrying the world's last hope. Her bare feet, grimy and aching, finally stopped before a skyscraper of glass and steel that seemed to scrape the stars. This was it. The sick woman on the sidewalk by the hospital had whispered the address. Her eyes filled with a sadness Leah couldn't understand, but had promised to help. The soft purr of a luxury engine broke the street's silence. A black car, long and gleaming like the night, pulled up to the curb. A uniformed chauffeur hopped out and opened the rear door. From it emerged a tall man with graying temples and a face that seemed carved from concern and power. Richard Sterling adjusted the knot of his silk tie, his mind still buzzing with the numbers from the latest quarterly report. His recent investment in tech stocks had yielded an extraordinary profit, adding another layer to his already colossal fortune. He was a multi-millionaire whose life was measured in profitability charts and the growth of his net worth. A universe of stocks and bonds, far removed from the filthy reality of this sidewalk. He was about to enter the building's lavish lobby when a small, trembling voice stopped him. "Mister?" Richard turned, impatience creasing his brow. He saw the tiny figure, a street kid like so many others. His eyes swept over her with the efficiency of someone assessing a problem to be quickly solved. He pulled his wallet from his pocket, ready to dismiss her with a few bills. "Money solved almost everything. I found this baby in the trash," Leah said, her voice steadier than she expected. She took a step forward, revealing the small, sleeping face among the rags. A short, humorless laugh escaped Richard's lips. "Oh, please, a new story every night. How much do you want?" He held out a crisp $100 bill, an automatic gesture. To him, it was a simple transaction, a small price to pay for his peace. But the girl didn't reach for it. Instead, her large brown eyes met his with a seriousness that disarmed him. "I don't want your money. I think he's yours." The audacity of the statement hit him. Irritation began to bubble up. Who did this little brat think she was? He was about to order his driver to get her out of there when, with a desperate motion, she lifted the baby a little higher. Pinned to the blanket by a safety pin was a small plastic hospital wristband. "Please, mister, just read the name." The mother's name. Richard sighed, overcome by fatigue and a spark of inexplicable curiosity. He leaned in, his eyes scanning the hasty script on the small white tag, and then the world stopped spinning. The city's noise vanished. The night's chill was nothing compared to the ice that spread through his veins. There, under the faint glow of the streetlight, was a name he hadn't heard in months, a name that was both a prayer and an open wound in his heart. Helena. The name on the wristband was a ghost. Helena. Richard felt the air thin in his lungs, as if he were on the top floor of one of his office towers, but instead of a breathtaking view, there was only an abyss opening at his feet. His brain, accustomed to calculating risks and analyzing the cash flow of his vast enterprises, simply shut down. It couldn't be. Helena had vanished from his life nearly a year ago, swept away by a storm of lies and accusations that he, in his wounded arrogance, had believed. He remembered the sharp pain, the betrayal Veronica had laid out for him with such convincing evidence, forged emails, paid-off testimonies. At the time, it had seemed easier to believe in malice than in his own intuition, which screamed that something was wrong. He'd had her fired. Not in person, of course. He'd sent a messenger from HR, a cowardly act that haunted him on the quietest nights. He had buried himself in work, multiplying his capital, treating love as just another high-risk investment that had resulted in a loss. A memory, vivid and painful, ambushed him, a Sunday afternoon, months before everything fell apart. He and Helena were in a simple park, far from the sophisticated circles he frequented. She was laughing, her face lit by the sun, talking about her dreams, a small house with a garden, no luxury, just peace. "You have so many assets, Richard," she had said with genuine tenderness, "but happiness isn't listed on your balance sheet." He had felt exposed, seen in a way no one ever had, not even the women who wore the diamond rings he'd given them. Helena didn't want his money, she wanted his soul, and that both terrified and fascinated him. It was this pure love that Veronica, with her cold, calculating ambition, had identified as a weakness to be exploited. Leah watched the man's face transform. The mask of power and impatience had shattered, revealing a deep confusion, a pain she somehow recognized. It was the look of someone who had lost something irreplaceable. She clutched the baby tighter, feeling the warmth of the small, fragile body. This man was their only chance. The sick woman, Helena, had made Leah promise, "Take him to his father. He's a good man, Leah. He's just blind." The girl didn't understand what it meant to be blind in that way, but she understood promises. They were the only valuable thing she owned. Richard's mind was a whirlwind. Helena, a baby, abandoned in the trash. The narrative didn't fit. The Helena he had loved, the woman with an immense heart who cried at movies and fed pigeons, would never abandon a child, unless Veronica's story was even darker than he'd imagined. Doubt, a poisonous seed, began to sprout. What if it had all been a setup? What if the woman now sleeping in his bed of Egyptian cotton sheets was the true architect of his misery? He looked at the girl, at her dirt, her thinness, but also at the fierce dignity in her eyes. She didn't look like she was lying. "Get in the car," he said, his voice hoarse, surprising himself and his driver, who was watching the scene in the rearview mirror with restrained astonishment. Leah hesitated for a moment, instinctive fear warring with hope, but the baby let out a small whimper, and the decision was made. She climbed into the vehicle, sinking into the soft leather that smelled of wealth. The blast of the heater was a welcome shock to her frozen skin. Richard got in after her, closing the door and sealing them off from the outside world. The silence inside the car was heavy, thick. He gazed at the small, sleeping face, trying to find traces of himself, traces of Helena. Then he turned to Leah, his gaze the scrutinizing look of a man who had built an empire by reading people. "How did you know where to find me? Who told you to come here?" Leah swallowed, her throat raw. "His mother told me," she whispered. "She said his father lived in the tallest building on the block, but she said something else, too. She said that the other lady, the one with the fancy hair and the expensive car, told her you'd never want to know about the baby." Those words, "the other lady," fell into the silence of the luxury car like stones on a frozen lake, shattering the surface of certainty Richard had built around himself. There was only one other lady with fancy hair and an expensive car in the equation of his life, with Helena, Veronica. Her image surfaced in his mind, sharp and cruel, elegant, ambitious. the perfect executive he had promoted to be his right hand in business and, later, in his personal life. She was the antithesis of Helena. Where Helena was warmth and simplicity, Veronica was polished steel and strategy. It was Veronica who had brought him the proof of Helena's infidelity. He remembered the scene in his office, the panoramic city view a silent witness. Veronica, with an expression of false solidarity, showing him photos, message transcripts. "I just want to protect you, Richard, and protect the company's assets. Someone like that isn't trustworthy." Blinded by wounded pride and the humiliation of thinking the only woman he truly loved saw him merely as a billionaire to be exploited, he had believed every word. Now, with a baby in a dirty blanket less than 3 feet away, the pieces of that puzzle began to rearrange themselves into a monstrous picture. Helena's dismissal, her disappearance, Veronica's emergence as his comforter, filling the void with calculated efficiency. It all suddenly seemed far too orchestrated. His vast fortune, his global investments, his ability to predict the stock market's movements, none of it had prepared him for the possibility of such an intimate and devastating manipulation. He had felt like a king in his empire of concrete and capital, but perhaps he had been nothing more than a pawn in a game he didn't even know was being played. The driver, George, maintained a professional discretion in the rearview mirror, but Richard could feel his curious eyes. "To the penthouse, George," he said, his voice firm out of pure habit, though inside everything was crumbling. Leah shrank into the seat. The man beside her seemed to have aged 10 years in 10 minutes. His initial anger had given way to a kind of terrifying desolation. She didn't understand business or women with fancy hair, but she understood sadness, and the rich man was drowning in it. The car glided smoothly into the underground garage and stopped in a private spot. The elevator was silent and swift, ascending the floors without a single jolt. The doors opened directly into a foyer, larger than all the places Leah had ever slept in combined. The white marble floor gleamed, reflecting the lights of a crystal chandelier that looked like a shower of diamonds frozen in time. Richard walked ahead, his shoulders tense, and opened the immense dark wood door. "Come in," he told Leah, his voice low. Leah entered with hesitant steps, awestruck and intimidated. The walls were glass, revealing the entire city lit up below. It felt like they were floating in the sky. She had never imagined such wealth could exist. The apartment was a sanctuary of minimalist luxury, cold and impersonal. Everything was grey, black, and white. There were no family photos, no warm colors, only modern art and designer furniture. Richard was about to say something, perhaps offer food or a place for the baby, when a melodic female voice drifted from the living room. "Richard, darling, you're late." I was starting to worry. There she was, Veronica, standing in the middle of the room, a glass of red wine in her hand. She wore a black silk dress that hugged her body perfectly. Her hair was in a flawless chignon, and her smile was radiant. A smile that froze instantly when her eyes landed on the small, grimy figure of Leah, and on the bundle she held so tightly in her arms. The silence that fell over the penthouse was sharper than the pre-dawn wind outside. Veronica's eyes narrowed, initial surprise giving way to a cold mask of contempt. She swept a gaze over Leah that made her feel even smaller and dirtier, as if her mere presence were a stain on the immaculate carpet. Veronica's attention, however, quickly fixed on the small bundle in the girl's arms. The polished smile vanished completely, replaced by an almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw. She knew that blanket. It was the same one she herself had given Helena weeks ago, a gesture of false charity, along with a handful of cash and poisonous words about how Richard would never forgive her. It had been a calculated move, part of her plan to ensure Helena disappeared forever, convinced it was for the child's own good. Seeing it here, in the living room of her victory, was an unacceptable contingency. "Richard, what is the meaning of this?" Veronica asked. Her voice controlled, but edged with a chill Leah had never heard before. Who is this child, and why did you bring her into our home? She took a step forward, her expensive perfume filling the air, a stark contrast to the street smell that Leah carried with her. Richard didn't answer immediately. His mind was working at high speed, processing the pieces that were clicking into place with terrifying clarity. Leah's words in the car. The other lady said you'd never want to know about the baby. Echoed in his head, now with a face and a name. He looked from Veronica, the personification of elegance and corporate success, to the frail girl and the helpless infant, two realities colliding in his living room. The doubt born on the sidewalk was now growing into a full-blown suspicion. He had always admired Veronica's ambition, her ruthless ability to close deals and boost the returns on his investment funds. But he had never stopped to consider how far that ambition might extend into the personal realm. "This is Leah," Richard said finally, his voice grave. "And she brought a baby she found." He chose his words carefully, watching Veronica's reaction. The relief on her face was visible, though it lasted only a second. "Found? For God's sake, Richard, it must be another scam. A street urchin with a sob story to get some money. You, of all people, should know better. Give her what she wants and send her away. I'll call security." She turned to grab the phone, the movement swift and decisive, a clear attempt to shut down the situation before it spun out of her control. "No!" Richard's voice was a command, not a request. Veronica froze, her hand hovering over the device. She turned back slowly, genuine surprise in her eyes. Richard rarely contradicted her so directly. "No," she repeated, arching a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "I want to hear her story," he said, his eyes fixed on Leah. "Tell me everything again, Leah, from the beginning. Don't be afraid." Leah, who had been paralyzed by the exchange, felt a spark of courage return. The beautiful woman scared her, but the rich man suddenly seemed like an ally. She took a deep breath. His mother was sick, near the hospital. She was scared. She gave him to me and asked me to bring him here. She told me her name, Helena. At the sound of the name, Veronica let the wine glass slip from her fingers. The crystal shattered on the marble, splashing a dark red liquid that looked unnervingly like blood. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the room, but no one moved. Veronica's eyes met Richard's, and for the first time since he'd known her, he saw something in her gaze that wasn't confidence or ambition. It was panic. The panic in Veronica's eyes was a flash of lightning illuminating the dark night of Richard's doubts. It lasted only a fraction of a second before being skillfully replaced by a calculated expression of shock and compassion. "Helena?" she whispered, her hand covering her mouth in a theatrical gesture of astonishment. "Oh my God, Richard! It can't be. After all this time?" She walked toward him, sidestepping the shards of glass with the grace of a ballerina, and touched his arm. "Darling, this is terrible, but we can't jump to conclusions. This girl could be lying. She might have heard the name somewhere." Her voice was a balm, smooth and reasonable, designed to soothe and, more importantly, to redirect his focus, to plant doubt about the only witness who threatened her perfect world. She was playing the most important hand of her life, and her performance had to be flawless, but the seed of suspicion in Richard had already taken root. The accident with the wine glass, the visceral reaction to the name Helena, those were genuine, not calculated. He gently removed Veronica's hand from his arm, a subtle gesture, but one that sounded like a fire alarm to her. He knelt, bringing himself to Leah's eye level, ignoring the woman standing beside him. His eyes, once cold and distant, were now intense, searching for the truth. "Leah, you said you saw her. Where is she now? We need to find her." Leah shrugged, fear tightening her throat again. The beautiful woman was looking at her in a way that made her want to disappear. "I don't know," she whispered. "She gave me the baby and told me to run. She was coughing a lot. There were some strange people near her. She told me not to go back there. The memory of the scene was a frightening blur. The darkness of the alley, Helena's ragged breathing, the palpable fear in her voice. Helena had insisted, pushing the baby into Leah's arms. "They can't find him. Promise me." Leah didn't know who they were, but the urgency in her voice was unforgettable. Veronica saw her opening. "You see, Richard, a confusing story with no proof. Strange people, a dark alley. It sounds like something a child would invent to make her story more dramatic." She was trying to plant the seed of distrust, to turn Leah's narrative into a childish fantasy. The real mother probably just abandoned him, and this girl saw a chance to take advantage of your well-known generosity. The word generosity was laced with a faint irony, a veiled reminder of how generous he had been with Helena in the past. Richard stood up, his face an impenetrable mask. He hadn't become a billionaire by accident. He had built his empire on his ability to read between the lines, to detect weaknesses and bluffs at a negotiation table. And Veronica was bluffing. "Perhaps," he said, his voice dangerously calm, "but there's one way to find out." He turned to Leah again. "Leah, his mother, Helena, did she give you anything else? Anything at all? A piece of paper? An object?" Leah thought for a moment. Searching the memories of the chaotic night, Helena had been weak, delirious. She had handed her the baby and something else, something small, which she had stuffed into the deep, patched pocket of her jacket. With trembling fingers, she reached into the pocket, past an old button and a piece of string. Then her fingers touched something soft. She pulled it out. It was a tiny blue wool bootie, the size of a thumb, and inside it, carefully folded, was a small piece of paper. It wasn't a letter, but something more formal. She unfolded it and handed it to the man. Richard took the crumpled paper. It was a pharmacy receipt, dated 2 days ago, and on the back, in a weak, shaky handwriting he would recognize anywhere in the world, was an address and a short sentence. "Tell him our son's name is Lucas." Lucas. The name hung in the charged air of the penthouse, simple, real, and carrying the weight of an irrefutable truth. For Richard, it was as if a locked door in his heart had been kicked open. Lucas, his grandfather's name. A name he and Helena had discussed on one of those lazy afternoons, full of whispered dreams and plans, long before the poison of suspicion had destroyed everything. "If we ever have a son, I want him to have your grandfather's strength," she had said, and he had laughed, calling her a dreamer. Now, the dream was here on a crumpled piece of paper, and the reality was a nightmare. The shaky handwriting, unmistakably Helena's, was the final proof he needed. There was no more room for Veronica's manipulations. The truth, delivered by the most unlikely messenger, was asserting itself with overwhelming force. He lifted his eyes from the note and stared at Veronica. Her mask, once so perfect, was now showing visible cracks. Veronica felt the floor disappear from under her. A pharmacy receipt, a wool bootie, details so small, so insignificant, yet capable of demolishing the fortress of lies she had built with such meticulous care. She had thought of everything, the dismissal, Helena's isolation, the way she would insert herself into Richard's life. She had followed Helena's pregnancy from a distance, using a cheap private investigator, waiting for the right moment to act. The plan to convince Helena to abandon the baby had been her masterstroke, the guarantee that the last link between Richard and his past would be severed. But she had underestimated 2 things: a mother's desperate love and a street kid's stubborn compassion. Her brain, always so quick with business strategies and asset acquisitions, struggled to find an escape route. Deny it, accuse the girl of forging everything. It was too late. The look on Richard's face was no longer one of doubt, but of a cold, silent fury that terrified her more than any shout. Richard carefully folded the paper and put it in his jacket pocket. It was evidence. He didn't yet know the full extent of the betrayal, but he knew with a visceral certainty that he had been deceived in a cruel and inhuman way. His son, his own son, had spent his first hours of life in a dumpster. The enormity of it hit him with the force of a physical blow. All his money, his fortune in stocks and cryptocurrency, his power, none of it could have protected the only thing that truly mattered. He felt powerless, a fool. He turned to Leah, who watched the scene with wide eyes, still holding little Lucas, who was beginning to stir, whimpering in his sleep. "Leah, you were very brave," he said, his voice now soft but firm. "You and Lucas need to rest. And to eat." He looked around his sterile apartment. There was nothing here for a baby, no crib, no bottle. The irony was brutal. He owned assets on multiple continents, but lacked the essentials to care for his own child. He picked up the intercom. "George, please come up and ask Mrs. Dawson, the housekeeper, to prepare the guest room. Tell her to buy everything necessary for a newborn. Immediately. I don't care about the cost." Veronica watched it all. Paralyzed, he was taking control, making decisions. He was taking in the child and its witness. She was losing. "Richard, wait," she said, her voice sounding desperate for the first time. "Let's talk about this. We can't make rash decisions based on the word of a homeless girl. We need to think about the business, about our image." It was the wrong thing to say. The mention of business, of image, at a moment like this, was the final straw. Richard turned to her, and the look in his eyes was that of a complete stranger. "Image," he repeated, the word dripping with contempt. "My son was in the trash, Veronica, and you're worried about image." He paused, letting the weight of his words fill the space between them. "I think the only thing we need to talk about is your access to my funds and your letter of resignation, but that can wait until morning. For now," he gestured toward the door, "I want you out of my apartment. Now." Richard's order, so direct and final, sucked all the air out of the room. Veronica stood motionless for an instant, shock plastered across her perfectly made-up face, to be thrown out. She, who had planned every step, every smile, every word to become the mistress of this empire, was being discarded like an unwanted liability on Richard's life balance sheet. The humiliation burned in her cheeks. But panic quickly gave way to her combative nature. She would not be defeated so easily, not after coming so close. She took a step forward, her voice low and hissing, one last desperate attempt to regain control. "You can't be serious, Richard. You're going to believe this absurd story, throw away everything we've built together over a lie told by a filthy child." She glared at Leah with pure hatred. "Look at her. Who knows where she got that baby? It could be anyone's." At that exact moment, the private elevator door slid open, and George, the driver, entered, followed by a kindly-looking, white-haired woman, Mrs. Dawson. They stopped in the foyer, sensing the electric tension in the air. But before anyone could speak, Leah, who had remained silent until now, took a step forward. The hatred in Veronica's eyes had scared her, but it had also ignited something inside her. A spark of indignation. She was not a liar. "I didn't lie," she said, her voice small but clear as a bell. "I saw you. You talked to Helena." The room fell deathly silent. Richard turned his head slowly toward Leah. "You what?" "I saw you," Leah repeated, gaining confidence. "It wasn't just today. It was a while ago, near the shelter where I sleep sometimes. You stopped your car, the expensive car, and you gave Helena money. But you weren't smiling. You looked angry. You said that Mr. Richard didn't want any trouble. You said it was better for everyone if she disappeared, that the baby would have a better life somewhere else." The revelation landed like a bomb. It was the missing piece, the link that connected Veronica not just to the knowledge of the pregnancy, but to the active manipulation of Helena. A flashback hit Richard with the force of a punch. He remembered a casual conversation with Veronica weeks ago. She had mentioned, in passing, making a generous donation to a homeless shelter in a rough part of town as part of the company's social responsibility initiatives. At the time, he had praised her for her altruism, for her dedication to improving the business's public image. Now, he saw the truth behind the gesture. It wasn't charity, it was surveillance. She had been monitoring Helena, making sure she stayed out of her way. The coldness of the plan was a cruelty his mind refused to process. Mrs. Dawson, the housekeeper, looked from Veronica to Leah, and her face filled with sudden understanding. Her eyes settled on the executive with a silent but powerful disapproval. George remained impassive, but his fists were clenched at his sides. Veronica turned pale. The girl was a witness, an unexpected and dangerous witness. Her plans, which had seemed so foolproof, were unraveling thread by thread. "This is absurd," she said, her voice a little too loud, bordering on hysterical. "This girl is making it all up. She's an opportunist. Richard, you have to believe me." But Richard was no longer listening. He was looking at Leah, at the unlikely courage in such a small frame, and then he looked at the baby, who was starting to wake in the girl's arms. He approached and, with a gentleness that surprised everyone, including himself, he held out his arms. "May I?" he asked Leah. She nodded and very carefully passed little Lucas into his father's arms. For the first time, Richard held his son. The baby was light, warm, and real. He opened his eyes, and they were Helena's eyes, blue, deep as the ocean. In that instant, all the money, the stocks, the wealth, lost all meaning. He looked up at Veronica over his son's head, and the final decision solidified in his heart. "Ah, George," he said, his voice thick with emotion but laced with a tone of steel. "Please escort Ms. Thorne to the door and ensure she does not enter this building again. Ever." Veronica's exit was devoid of any further drama. Faced with Richard's final command and George's unwavering stare, her mask of defiance finally shattered, revealing the cornered and defeated woman beneath. She didn't say another word. She just cast one last look at Richard, a look that mixed hatred, disbelief, and the bitter acknowledgement of her loss, before turning and walking toward the elevator. The soft closing of the metal doors was the definitive sound of the end of a dark chapter in Richard's life. The silence that followed was no longer tense, but strangely peaceful, filled only by the soft breathing of little Lucas in his arms. Richard felt the tiny yet monumental weight of his son. It was an overwhelming sensation, a mix of joy, terror, and a regret so deep it was a physical ache. How could he have been so blind? How could he have let pride and lies drive him away from a love so true and from the miracle of his own child? Mrs. Dawson, with the sensitivity of someone who had served the Sterling family for decades, broke the silence. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice gentle, "the boy needs warmth and milk. And the young lady," she looked at Leah with a tenderness the girl hadn't received in a very long time, "needs a hot bath and a good dinner." The housekeeper was the personification of order in the midst of chaos. Within minutes, she had everything organized. George was dispatched with an emergency shopping list. Leah was gently guided to a guest suite, a luxurious room with a bathroom that looked like it was out of a magazine. For the first time in years, the girl felt the warmth of a real shower, washing away not just the grime from her body, but some of the weariness from her soul. Mrs. Dawson left fresh, soft clothes on the bed, hand-me-downs from her own granddaughter, and a bowl of hot soup that smelled like home. Meanwhile, Richard was clumsily trying to care for Lucas. He felt like a complete stranger in his own apartment, a billionaire who commanded board meetings with world leaders but didn't know how to change a diaper. Mrs. Dawson helped him with infinite patience, showing him how to hold the baby, how to prepare the formula. Every small gesture was a discovery. The way Lucas's tiny fingers gripped his, the sound of his breathing. These were the details he had almost lost forever. Amidst it all, one question tormented him, throbbing in his mind like an open wound. Where was Helena? The address on the pharmacy receipt was his only clue. A street in a poor neighborhood, miles away from the luxury of his penthouse. She was sick, Leah had said, and scared. A fear he now understood had been instilled, drop by Veronica's cruelty. Later, with Lucas asleep in an improvised crib of soft cushions, Richard went to the room where Leah was. She had eaten and was sitting on the edge of the king-sized bed, looking even smaller in the vast space. She was staring out the panoramic window at the city lights, which formed a carpet of artificial stars. "Leah," he said, stopping at the door. She turned, her eyes large and serious. "The baby, is he okay?" "He's okay." Richard smiled, a genuine smile, the first in a long time. "Thanks to you. I can never thank you enough." He entered the room and sat in an armchair. "I need to ask you one more thing. I know you're tired, but it's very important. You told me you saw Veronica talking to Helena. Do you remember anything else? Any detail? What did they say? How did Helena seem?" Leah frowned, searching her memory. "Helena was crying a lot," she began. "The other lady, Veronica, said she was doing it to help, that you were very angry with Helena, and that if you found out about the baby, you would take him from her forever. She said you were powerful and that Helena didn't stand a chance. She gave her some money and told her to go far away to start a new life, and she told her to never try to contact you again. Helena didn't want to go, but she seemed so scared. She just kept saying she wanted her son to be okay." Every word from Leah was another nail hammered into the coffin of the image Richard had of himself. Powerful. The word Veronica had used to intimidate Helena now sounded like an accusation. He had used his power and wealth to isolate himself, to build walls, and Veronica had simply taken advantage of those walls to trap Helena on the outside. The cruelty of the plan was diabolically sophisticated, to use Richard's own character against him. Veronica knew his wounded pride would make him deaf to any attempt Helena might make to explain herself. She knew the threat of using his power to take the baby would be the ultimate weapon to force a desperate mother into submission. And it had worked. Helena hadn't just been fired, she had been terrorized, convinced that the man she loved hated her and posed a threat to her child. The pain Richard felt was replaced by a cold, sharp anger at Veronica, but mostly at his own blindness. He looked at Leah, at the clarity with which she recounted the events. The girl wasn't interpreting, she was bearing witness. "And you, Leah? How did you meet Helena?" "I'd seen her near the hospital for a few weeks," Leah explained. "She slept on a bench sometimes. She was always sad. I'd share my bread with her when I had some. She was kind, she told me stories, talked about her baby's father, said he was a good man, but that he'd been tricked by a bad woman. She never said his name, just that he lived in the sky." Leah pointed toward the tops of the skyscrapers visible from the window. "I'm in a glass castle. It was only tonight, when she got really sick, that she gave me the address and his name. A good man who had been tricked." Helena's words, filtered through Leah's innocence, were a knife in his chest. Even after everything, even believing he had rejected her, she still defended him. Her love had weathered the storm of lies, even if his had capsized. The urge to find her became unbearable. He needed to see her, to beg for forgiveness, even if there was no forgiveness possible for what he had allowed to happen. He stood up. "Leah, you're going to stay here. Mrs. Dawson will take care of you and Lucas. You're safe now. I have to go out. I have to find Helena." Leah just nodded, understanding the gravity of the mission. Richard went down to the garage. The address from the pharmacy receipt led him into a labyrinth of narrow, poorly lit streets, a world completely different from his own. It was a part of the city his luxury real estate investments ignored, a place where survival was the only daily goal. He parked his luxury sedan a few blocks away, feeling like an intruder, a tourist in a land of misery. The building was a decrepit tenement, its walls stained with damp, the smell of mildew heavy in the air. He climbed the creaking stairs, his heart pounding. The apartment number matched a splintered wooden door on the top floor. He knocked. Silence. He knocked again, harder. He heard the sound of shuffling feet, and the door opened a crack, held by a security chain. An elderly woman with a wrinkled face and tired eyes peered through the gap. "Yes, I'm looking for Helena. Helena Silver," Richard said, his own voice sounding foreign to him in these surroundings. The woman sized him up, suspicion written all over her face. "Who's asking?" "I'm a friend, an old friend. It's very important that I find her. I was told she was sick." The woman's expression softened slightly, giving way to sadness. "Sick is putting it mildly, son. The poor girl. She's gone." Richard's world stopped. The floor seemed to vanish. "Gone? What do you mean, gone? Where did she go?" The old woman sighed, a heavy, resigned sound. "Don't know where to. She left last night, seemed desperate. Left behind on her rent and almost nothing else. Just told me she couldn't stay here anymore, that some people were after her. For a few weeks, a fancy car would just sit on the corner, watching. She thought they were your people. Was terrified you were going to come and take her son." The woman's words fell on Richard like an avalanche, burying the small flame of hope he had been carrying. "Your people." Veronica's lie continued to haunt him, to poison everything. Helena had fled, terrified, believing he was the monster hunting her. The fancy car, undoubtedly, was Veronica's private investigator, an intimidating presence to ensure Helena remained cornered and afraid. The feeling of powerlessness was crushing. He, a man whose net worth allowed him to track any financial asset in the world, could not find the woman he loved. She had become a ghost, haunted by a fear he had, indirectly, helped create. He thanked the woman, his voice a hollow echo of itself, and walked back down the stairs, feeling the weight of every step. The night outside seemed darker, the city more hostile. He returned to the penthouse like an automaton. As he entered, Mrs. Dawson met him in the foyer, her face worried. "Any news, sir?" Richard just shook his head, the defeat evident in his slumped shoulders. He walked to the living room and stood before the glass wall, staring at the city lights without really seeing them. He felt like a king in an empty castle. He had his son back, a miracle for which he would be eternally grateful to Leah. But the family he could have had was incomplete, broken by his own failure. Where could she have gone? Penniless, sick, alone. Despair began to set in. He had to do something. He couldn't just wait. He picked up his phone, ready to deploy the best team of private investigators his money could buy. He would hire dozens of people if necessary. He would scour every corner of the city. Meanwhile, in the guest room, Leah couldn't sleep. Despite the comfort of the bed and the quiet of the apartment, her mind was racing. The sadness on the rich man's face when he returned haunted her. She felt responsible somehow. If she'd only been faster, if she had found Helena sooner. She got up and went to the living room, finding Richard standing by the window. She approached silently, not knowing what to say. Richard sensed her presence and turned. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice tired. Leah shook her head. "Helena, she gave me something else," she said, almost in a whisper. The memory had surfaced suddenly, a detail lost in the chaos of the night. "It wasn't for me. She said it was for the baby, for when he got older, so he would know where he came from." Richard's heart leapt. "What, Leah? What did she give you?" Leah reached into the inner pocket of her old jacket, which Mrs. Dawson had insisted on washing and mending for her. From it, She pulled a small object wrapped in a piece of flannel. She unwrapped it carefully. It was a small silver locket, simple and slightly dented. It was shaped like a heart. She said it was the only valuable thing she owned, that it belonged to her mother. Richard took the locket with trembling hands. He recognized the broken clasp, which he himself had once tried to fix unsuccessfully. He pressed the small catch, and the locket sprang open. On one side was an empty space for a photograph. On the other, protected by a tiny piece of plastic. There was no picture, but a tiny piece of paper folded into an almost microscopic square. With his fingernail, he managed to pry it out and unfolded it with surgical delicacy. It was a bus ticket, a one-way ticket, purchased 2 days ago. The destination printed on it made Richard's blood run cold. It wasn't a neighborhood or a street. It was the name of a small, forgotten town upstate, over 300 miles away. The town where Helena had been born, and where she had always told him she had no one left. That bus ticket was more than a clue. It was a testament to Helena's desperation. To return to the hometown she had fled years ago, a place that she said held only memories of hardship and loss. She would only do that if she believed she had absolutely no other option in the world. Richard felt a wave of urgency wash away the fatigue and defeat. She wasn't just hiding. She was retreating to the only refuge she had left. However imperfect, he had to go there, and he had to go now. The idea of deploying his private investigators vanished. This was personal. It was a pilgrimage he had to make himself. "Mrs. Dawson," he called out, his voice now filled with a new determination. The housekeeper appeared promptly. "Pack a bag for me, please. Just the essentials. And prepare everything for Lucas and Leah. You're both coming with me." The surprise on Mrs. Dawson's face was clear, but she only nodded. "Yes, sir. Where are we going?" "To a town called Hope Falls," he said, the name of the town sounding like a cruel irony. Leah, who had heard everything, widened her eyes. "I'm going too." The idea of leaving New York City, of going to a place she didn't even know existed, was both scary and exciting. "Yes," Richard replied, looking at her with profound gratitude. "You started this, Leah, and you're going to be there when it ends. You're part of this family now." The words came out naturally, a truth he had only just discovered but felt deep in his bones. The girl who had saved his son was no longer a stranger. She was the unlikely hero of his story. The journey began before dawn. George drove the luxury sedan out of the city, leaving the skyscrapers and bustling avenues behind, heading onto highways that cut through green fields and rolling hills. Lucas slept peacefully in his high-tech car seat, a marvel of safety and design. Leah spent most of the time in silence, her face pressed to the window, watching a world she had never seen, trees, cows, houses with yards. It was like a movie. Richard, in the passenger seat, spent the hours in a whirlwind of thought. He replayed every conversation with Helena, every smile, every fight, searching for the signs he had ignored. He remembered her talking about Hope Falls with a mix of nostalgia and sadness, describing a small white house with blue shutters where her grandmother used to grow the most beautiful roses in the county, a house that had been sold long ago. They reached Hope Falls in the late afternoon. The town seemed frozen in time. A town square with a bandstand, a church with a tall steeple and cobblestone streets. There was no sign of Helena. Richard felt a chill of doubt. What if she wasn't here? What if the ticket was a false trail? He checked into the town's only hotel, a charming old building. After settling Mrs. Dawson, Leah, and Lucas, he went out to search. He showed a photo of Helena to the hotel clerk, the pharmacist, the priest at the church. No one had seen her. Discouragement began to creep back in. While Richard searched, Leah felt a restlessness. The small town air was clean, but something was bothering her. She asked Mrs. Dawson for permission to walk around the square, right in front of the hotel. Sitting on a bench, she watched the few people passing by. That's when she saw an elderly woman with white hair in a bun, watering a bed of red roses in front of a small corner house. The roses were so vibrant, so full of life. They reminded her of something Helena had told her in one of their conversations. A story about her grandmother who used to say that where there are roses, there is hope. Driven by an instinct she couldn't explain, Leah got up and crossed the street. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, her voice shy. "Your roses are very pretty." The woman smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her wrinkled face. "Thank you, dear. They're a lot of work, but they're worth it." Leah hesitated. "Ma'am, by any chance, do you know a young woman named Helena? She has blue eyes and the saddest smile I've ever seen." The woman's smile vanished. She set down her watering can and looked at Leah intently. "Helena, my dear friend Rosa's granddaughter. Why are you looking for her?" She had a baby," Leah said, "and we're worried about her. She was sick." The old woman's eyes filled with tears. "Sick and heartbroken," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "She showed up here 2 days ago, like a lost soul. Pale, weak, said she'd lost her son, that he didn't make it." The revelation hit Leah like a bucket of ice water. Helena believed Lucas was dead. Veronica's lie was even more cruel and profound than any of them could have imagined. She hadn't just convinced Helena to abandon her son. She had made her believe the most devastating lie of all, ensuring Helena would never come back, looking for the child, trapping her in a prison of grief and guilt. The pain of that discovery pierced Leah's chest. She understood, in that moment, the depth of Helena's sad smile. It wasn't just sadness. It was the abyss of mourning. The girl looked at the Lady of the Roses, her eyes wide with urgency. "That's not true. The baby's alive. He's okay. He's here with his father. Where is she? Please, tell me where she is." The woman, whose name was Mrs. Amelia Clark, turned pale, her hand flying to her chest in shock. "Alive?" But she was so certain, so broken. She looked at the girl with a new understanding. "Oh, dear God, she's in the little cottage in my backyard. I couldn't leave her on the street in that state. But she won't talk to anyone. She just cries." Leah didn't wait to hear more. "Stay here," she yelled over her shoulder and ran, her small legs moving faster than they ever had. She sprinted across the square and burst through the hotel doors. "Mr. Richard, Mr. Richard?" she cried, her voice echoing in the quiet lobby. Richard, who was returning from his fruitless search, despair etched on his face, saw Leah's agitation and his heart froze. "Leah, what is it? Did something happen to Lucas?" "No, it's Helena. I found her. But it's worse than we thought," she said, breathless, trying to explain between gasps. "She thinks Lucas, that he died." The impact of those words was physical. Richard staggered, leaning against a lobby pillar for support. A guttural sound of pure anguish escaped his lips. He closed his eyes. The image of Helena, alone, mourning the death of a son who was alive and safe just yards away, was unbearable torture. All the suffering, all the pain had been meticulously planned. Veronica hadn't just wanted to get rid of Helena. She wanted to destroy her emotionally, to eradicate her completely. The rage he had felt before was nothing compared to the glacial fury that now consumed him. But there was no time for rage. There was only time for Helena. "Where?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Leah led him back across the square, with Mrs. Dawson following closely behind, carrying Lucas in her arms as if she instinctively knew the baby's presence was crucial. Mrs. Amelia Clark was waiting for them at her gate, her eyes still wet with tears. She led them through the rose-scented garden to a small wooden cottage at the back of the property. The door was closed. The single window was covered by a thin curtain. Richard stopped in front of the door, his heart hammered against his ribs. What would he say? How could he even begin to fix what had been so brutally broken? He took a deep breath, raised his hand, and knocked gently on the wood. There was no answer. He knocked again, a little harder. "Helena!" he called out, his voice breaking. "Helena, it's me, Richard. Please, open the door." A heavy silence answered him. Then, a weak, almost inaudible voice came from inside. "Go away," she whispered. "There's nothing for you here. You were right. I'm worthless. I lost him. I lost our son." Every word was a stab wound. Richard pressed his forehead against the cool wood, the tears he had held back for so long finally streaming down his face. "And no, Helena, you didn't lose him," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "She lied to you about everything, about me and about him." He looked at Mrs. Dawson, who stepped forward and handed him little Lucas. Richard held his son tightly. "Helena, our son is here. He's alive, and he needs his mother. Please, my love, open the door." On the other side of the door, Helena heard the words, and her entire body began to tremble. It couldn't be. It was a cruel trick, a hallucination brought on by her grieving mind. But then she heard it, a small, fragile, but unmistakable sound, the soft cry of a newborn, the cry of her son. The sound of Lucas's cry pierced the wooden door and shattered the spell of despair that held Helena captive. For a long moment she remained motionless, her heart torn between the most impossible hope and the fear that her grief was playing a cruel trick on her. But the cry persisted, a real and insistent call that her maternal instincts could not ignore. With trembling hands, moving as if in a dream, she unlatched the door and slowly pulled it open. The late afternoon light blinded her for a second, and then she saw him. Richard stood there, his face streaked with tears, and in his arms, wrapped in a blue blanket, was the tiny miracle she thought she had lost forever. Her eyes, which for days had reflected only the darkness of morning, filled with the image of her son, alive, pink, and perfect. A sob escaped her lips, a sound that contained all the pain, longing, and overwhelming relief she felt. Richard took a step forward and, with the gentleness of someone handling the world's most precious treasure, placed Lucas in Helena's arms. The contact was electric. Helena hugged her son, her face buried in the soft blanket, inhaling the baby scent that was the ultimate proof he was real. Tears flowed freely, washing away the guilt and sorrow. Lucas, feeling his mother's warmth and scent, stopped crying and snuggled into her chest. They were whole again. Richard watched the scene, his heart overflowing with an emotion so intense he could barely breathe. He reached out and touched Helena's face, wiping away a tear with his thumb. "Forgive me," he whispered, his voice heavy with the full weight of his regret. "I was a fool, blinded by pride. I should have looked for you. I should have fought for us. I never stopped loving you, Helena, never." Helena looked up at him, and through her tears, she saw the man she loved, stripped of his multimillionaire armor, vulnerable and sincere. She saw the pain in his eyes, a reflection of her own. In that moment, there was no room for blame, only for the truth that bound them together. "She told me you hated me," she whispered, "that you would take our son from me." "She lied," Richard said, his voice firm. "She lied about everything." He then glanced at the small figure standing a step behind him. "If it wasn't for Leah, I never would have found out. She saved us, Helena. She saved our family." Helena's gaze fell upon the street girl who had been her only friend in her days of despair, the one to whom she had entrusted her most precious gift. And now, here she was, the unlikely guardian of her happiness. "Leah," Helena said, her voice filled with gratitude, "you kept your promise." Leah smiled, a shy smile that lit up her face. For the first time in her life, she felt like she belonged to something. She was no longer invisible. In the days that followed, the cottage in Mrs. Amelia Clark's backyard became a sanctuary of healing. Richard told Helena the whole story, every detail of Veronica's manipulation. Helena, in turn, told him of the fear, loneliness, and despair that had consumed her. They talked, they cried, and slowly, they began to rebuild the bridges that had been dynamited between them. Richard cared for Helena and Lucas with a devotion that surprised everyone, changing diapers, preparing bottles, simply being present in a way he never had been before. He learned that the true value of his assets wasn't in the interest on his investments or the price of his stocks, but in the ability to provide safety and comfort for his family. A week later, once Helena was stronger, Richard made a decision. He called his lawyers in New York and gave them clear instructions. He wanted Veronica to answer for her actions, not for revenge, but for justice. A lawsuit was filed, accusing her of child endangerment, fraud, and coercion. The evidence was overwhelming. Leah's testimony, Mrs. Clark's account of the car watching Helena, and Helena's own terrified confessions. The news of the investigation rocked the business world, but Richard didn't care. His priorities had changed. He found Helena sitting in the garden, with Lucas asleep in her lap and Leah at her side, showing the girl how to tend to the roses. The scene was the very picture of peace. He approached and knelt in front of her. He took a small velvet box from his pocket. "I know I can't erase the pain I've caused," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I can promise to spend every day of the rest of my life making you happy. Helena Silva, will you marry me and give me the honor of officially being the father to our son and our daughter?" He looked from Helena to Leah, including the girl in his proposal. Helena looked at the man before her, at the son in her arms, and at the girl who had become a daughter to her, and the tears that came this time were of pure happiness. "Yes," she whispered, "yes, I will." 6 weeks after that cold pre-dawn in New York City, the morning sun streamed through the windows of the small white house with blue shutters in Hope Falls, illuminating a scene of happy domesticity Richard had never thought possible for himself. He had used part of his vast capital not to buy another skyscraper, but to repurchase Helena's grandmother's old house and completely renovate it, turning it into a home. The once neglected garden now overflowed with the most vibrant roses in the county, carefully tended by Leah and Mrs. Clark, who had become a surrogate grandmother to the family. The house wasn't an opulent mansion, but a haven of peace, a place where true net worth was measured in smiles and hugs. The wedding had been a simple, intimate ceremony in the garden, with only Mrs. Clark, Mrs. Dawson, and George as witnesses. Richard's greatest victory was not a billion-dollar deal or a spike in his dividends, but the yes whispered by Helena. News from New York came via his lawyers. Veronica, facing irrefutable evidence and a career-destroying scandal, had been convicted. The justice of men had been served, but for Richard and Helena, true justice was the happiness they were building, far from the toxicity of the corporate world. He continued to manage his businesses from a distance. With a new perspective, he realized that real wealth wasn't accumulating assets, but having the freedom to use them to protect and nurture those he loved. He established a social impact fund, a foundation in Leah's name, dedicated to helping homeless children, ensuring that other Leahs would have the chance she almost didn't. Helena flourished. The sad smile was replaced by a luminous serenity. Motherhood suited her, and rediscovered love had healed her deepest scars. She found her purpose not in a career or status, but in building her family, in the simplicity of days spent caring for Lucas and teaching Leah to read and write. Seeing the spark of discovery in Leah's eyes with every new word learned was a greater reward to her than any material inheritance. And Leah, the girl who was once invisible to the world, was now the center of her new family's universe. She had her own room, painted her favorite color, with a bookshelf full of books. But more than that, she had gained parents who loved her unconditionally and a baby brother who adored her. The official adoption process was the first thing Richard and Helena did after the wedding, sealing the bond that already existed in their hearts. The girl who had saved a baby from the trash found that, in doing so, she had saved herself. Her unwavering compassion was not a weakness, but her greatest strength. Her voice, which no one had heard before, had become the instrument that reunited a family and exposed a great injustice. On that sunny morning, Richard stood on the porch, Lucas in one arm, watching Helena and Leah in the garden. Leah, with a pair of gardening shears, snipped a perfect red rose and handed it to Helena. The two of them laughed, a crystalline sound that was the soundtrack to his new life. He realized that for years he had sought success at the top of steel and glass towers, in numbers rising on a screen, but the only cash flow that mattered now was the flow of love that ran through this house. The tycoon who had almost lost everything to pride had learned that true love, when wounded, doesn't die. It just waits, patiently, for a chance to be found again. The housekeeper who had been cruelly deceived discovered her inner strength was greater than any manipulation. And the girl who lived in the shadows had taught them all that the purest acts of courage and kindness can come from the most humble hearts, proving that the truth, even when whispered by the voice of a child, is the most powerful force in the universe.